Chapter 17, Sunhee, 1943-44. After Uncle left, I couldn't trust myself to speak. It seemed that my mouth and heart and eyes were all connected. When I opened my mouth to talk, my eyes would fill with tears. To keep from crying, I had to close my mouth, so I didn't talk much. But that was all right, really. To talk, you have to think. And I couldn't think either. It was like being frozen, not outside, since my body still moved and did the things I needed it to do. But inside, everything, my mind, my feelings, was like ice. No, that wasn't right either. Ice was cold. Ice felt like something. This was nothing. A great big hole. When I turned my thoughts inside, there was nothing there. It helped a little that my body was very busy. Taeil and some of his classmates were building the airstrip instead of going to school, and there were changes at my school too. At least one full day every week was devoted to preparations for an invasion. We'd been without a radio for more than a year now, so we heard nothing of this. We learned only what the Japanese officials wanted to tell us at the neighborhood accountings. But what they were having us do at school was a sign of their concern. It seemed that the Americans and their allies were pushing hard, so hard that Japanese feared an invasion of Korea or even the islands of Japan. My classmates and I were required to make huge piles of stones. If the enemy invaded the town, we were to pelt them with the stones. We filled hundreds of sandbags. The military took them away. It was hard work, but I was glad. The work made me tired enough to sleep at night. It was only after defense preparation work that I slept well. We sharpened bamboo poles, one for every student. These were stored leaning up against the courtyard wall. If the enemy advanced as far as the school, we were to take up the poles and bayonet them. We practiced driving a bayonet into a dummy made of straw that hung from a wooden framework. One soldier, Buntaro-san, would say over and over again through the megaphone. He was the military attaché at this school, the position Onishi-san had held at my elementary school. If 3 of you work together to bayonet just one soldier, you will be heroes to the imperial forces. The emperor will honor you personally. 1 soldier for every 3 students. That is all he asks. Standing in line, waiting for my turn to bayonet the dummy, I looked around the courtyard. There, we were in our worn-out uniforms, which used to be navy blue but had faded to gray. 100 or so schoolgirls, some older than me, but some 2 or 3 years younger, and I was only 13. With flimsy bamboo poles, most of which weren't even sharpened properly. We were to defeat the enemy invaders with their guns and grenades and bombs. Suddenly, I thought of Uncle. How I wished I could tell him about this. He'd have made some kind of funny joke. I tried to think of what he might say, but nothing came to me. I couldn't see the funny side, the way he would have. But I did manage a half smile at one thing. It was the first time I thought of him without crying. Jeong-shin caught my eye. And I could see too that she was thinking how ridiculous this was. Just suppose she and I and another classmate were able to corner an American soldier. He'd have to be all by himself, unarmed, and weak enough to be overcome by 3 schoolgirls. Even if that did happen, I was sure I wouldn't be able to do as Buntaro-san was commanding. Stabbing a man would be quite a different thing from stabbing a straw dummy. I couldn't understand what the Japanese were thinking. Did they really believe we Koreans had been transformed somehow, that we were now Japanese? Didn't they know that we wanted the Americans to come to Korea and fight them? But I was worried about something. I'd heard that the missionaries and other white people who had come to Korea couldn't tell the difference between Koreans and Japanese on sight. This astounded me. Both had black hair and dark eyes. It was true. But Japanese men especially were easy to tell apart from Koreans. They were much shorter and their complexions were darker, more olive-toned, and the way they walked was different, stronger, almost arrogant. Maybe the American soldiers would be like the missionaries. Maybe they wouldn't know the difference between Koreans and Japanese. They'd think we are all the same, like those black-haired people in the film. One fall afternoon, we were in the schoolyard, having bamboo bayonet practice. We heard the drone of a plane approaching and waited for the usual all-clear siren, which meant that it was a Japanese plane and that there was nothing to worry about. But for the first time ever, no signal came. We'd been drilled countless times on what to do if this happened. In seconds, we had lined up and were marching back to our classrooms. There, we crouched beneath desks and tables as far away from the windows as possible. The silence was eerie. Not one student cried or screamed. The engine noise grew louder and louder, and I braced myself, waiting for a bomb to hit the school. Now, some of the girls had tears rolling down their faces. Others moved their lips in silent prayer. The girl next to me had fallen over in a faint. Oddly, this made me feel stronger. I didn't want to faint. I wanted to be aware, to see what happened. But now, the noise of the plane was growing fainter and fainter, and soon we could no longer hear it. There was no sound of an explosion, no firestorm. What did it mean? The teacher crawled out from under her desk. She went to a window and slid it aside, looking out cautiously. Past her head, I could see a patch of sky. It was snowing. Not snowflakes, paper. The sky was filled with falling paper. We heard the all-clear signal, then Bontarosang's voice in the courtyard shouting through the megaphone. "In your seats, everyone," the teacher ordered. "Keoko, go out to the courtyard and find out what is going on." I rushed outside. The yard was filled with students and teachers milling about in confusion. Quickly, I picked up one of the pieces of paper. It was a little folded leaflet, and tucked it into my waistband without looking at it. Meanwhile, Bontarosang was screaming into a megaphone. All students were to pick up the leaflets and bring them at once to the back of the school. No leaflets were to be left on the school grounds or even thrown into a waste bin. Every single one was to be burned. The leaflets in my waistband scratched and tickled me all the rest of the day. I was terrified that someone would catch me with it, but for the first time in weeks, my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I wanted to know what it said. If the Japanese didn't want us to read it, it had to be important. Later, I learned that the Youth Air Corps, including Tail, had been sent throughout the town and into the surrounding hills to pick up the leaflets. There was a neighborhood accounting to announce that anyone caught with one of the leaflets would be severely punished. Soldiers went door to door and searched every home. It all happened so quickly that not many people had a chance to read the leaflet. It was written in Korean, so most people couldn't have read it anyway. We all still spoke Korean at home, but only older people, those who had learned to read before the Japanese occupation, could read it. Taeil had once told me that 아버지 could read and write Hangul, the Korean alphabet. 아버지 would be able to tell me what the leaflet said. When I arrived home from school, Taeil met me in the courtyard. "Did you see it? Did you see the plane?" I told him no, that we'd hurried inside. "I saw it," he said proudly. "It flew right over the airfields, honey. You should have seen how fast it went. And the pilot waggled his wings when he went over us, like he was waving. You'd have thought he'd been flying the plane himself. I showed him the leaflet I'd hidden. He grinned at me and pulled one out of his waistband. 아버지 came home and Tail gave him the leaflets. He read one of them quickly, raising his eyebrows. Then he put them into the stove and burned them. He did it all slowly, deliberately. I thought he'd never get around to telling us what they said. Finally, he turned to us. The leaflets are from the Americans, he said, signed by an army general, a man named MacArthur. He says it is known that the Korean people are not Americans' enemies, and he promises that Korea will never be bombed by American planes. The Americans knew. They knew that Koreans weren't the same as Japanese. Uncle's words to Tail came back to me in a great rush about how we Koreans weren't allowed to be Korean. What did it mean to be Korean when for all my life Korea had been part of Japan? It took the words of a man I'd never heard of, a faraway American, to make me realize something that had been inside me all along. Korean was the jokes and stories Uncle told us. It was the flag had drawn. It was the Rose of Sharon tree 어머니 had saved. And the little circle Tail had carved on the bottom of the gourd bowls. Korean was the thoughts of Mrs. An in her own language, not someone else. And my thoughts too. I was Korean. My thoughts were Korean. I was so impressed by this idea that I went at once to the cupboard and fetched a tablet of paper and a pencil. From now on, I would keep a diary. When Uncle came back, he'd want to know about things like the leaflets and the bayonet practice. A diary would help me remember. My first entry, paper fell from the sky today. I looked at the line on the page and frowned. My handwriting was, as always, quite tidy, but it was in Japanese. I couldn't write in Korean. I'd never been taught how. Could Korean thoughts be written in Japanese? The next night after dinner, I spoke to 아버지. I would like to learn Hangul, I said. Would you teach me? 아버지 looked surprised for a brief moment. Then his eyelids dropped quickly and his expression grew blank. The teaching of Hangul is illegal, he said quietly. Yes, 아버지, I bowed my head respectfully. Illegal in school, but I was wondering. I chose my next words carefully. Does that mean it is also illegal in someone's house where nobody else could see or hear? Again, there was a look of surprise on his face, one eyebrow raised. He was quiet for a long time, but I sat very still and waited. At last, he looked up and spoke slowly. Sonny, it is not the right time. There are too many eyes around us just now. Pause. But I promise one day to teach you Hangul. I bowed and left the room, thinking about what 아버지 had said. Too many eyes. I understood this. The Japanese were watching us because of Uncle's escape. Not as closely as during the first few weeks, but still more than usual. We might be studying Hangul, and soldiers might burst in on us. It was too dangerous. I promised one day. One day? When? When would the Japanese let us have our own language back? Still, it was a promise. 아버지 almost never said promise. When he said it, he meant it. But for the time being, I had to write in my diary in Japanese. I kept it faithfully, at least a line or two every day about the day's events. When nothing special happened, I wrote a little poem. Sometimes I tried to make these funny, as Uncle might like them that way. Splash! A moment of clumsiness. My soup travels from the bowl through the air to my skirt, and I travel with it to the shores of 어머니's disapproval. But often I could not keep the melancholy out of my words. If I could choose to be anything, I would choose wind. I would blow my way swiftly to wherever you are and hide myself among the leaves of the nearest tree. 어머니 and 아버지 never talked about uncle. If 아버지 knew anything about him, he never told us. It was almost worse than if he died. If he were died, they have talked about him. At least, Tail still talked about uncle. To be honest, we didn't mention him often. It made us both too sad. But sometimes when I was out on the street with Tail, I'd see his eyes darting about, searching people's faces. I knew he was looking for uncle, just as I was. At those times, it made me feel stronger to have Tail nearby, to know we were thinking the same thoughts. In early spring of 1944, our classes stopped entirely. We still reported to school every day, but all of our time was spent on preparations for an enemy invasion. There had been no battles in Korea, yet the war was so much a part of our lives. Thousands of people had been separated from their families, forced to move to Manchuria and Japan to work for war industries. College students had to join the Imperial Army. Soldiers took not only rice and metal, but anything edible or useful that they could get their hands on. 어머니 worked harder and harder to put skimpy meals on the table. We weren't starving, but we never had quite enough to eat either. And the mountains had changed color. Our town was surrounded by mountains. Before the war, those mountains had been covered with forests. When the Japanese took all the coal and oil for the war effort, we had to use wood for fuel. One after another, trees were chopped down, until at last there was hardly a tree anywhere. We used to be able to see green and pleasant slopes. Now they were brown, gray, dead. We knew what had happened to the trees. They had been burned, but we didn't know what had happened to many of the people in our town. One day, they were there, and the next, they were gone. Taken away by the Japanese, then much we knew, but to where? One afternoon, as we were building rock piles in the schoolyard, Buntaro-san took up the megaphone. All girls 16 years and older, report to the northeast corner. All girls 16 and older. The rest of you, continue your work. I was working with Jungshin. She brought the rocks to me and I arranged them in neat piles. We were in the southeast corner of the yard and could hear everything. When the older girls had lined up, the principal began speaking to them. His Divine Majesty the Emperor is giving you girls a wonderful opportunity. There is great need for workers in Japan, in the textile factories, making uniforms for the honorable members of the imperial forces. You will be given a place to stay and ample food to eat, and a salary will be paid to your families here in Korea. It is a chance to help both the empire and your own family. Who among you would like to volunteer for this noble cause? The job sounded too good to be true. We were all accustomed to figuring out the real meaning behind what the Japanese said or wrote, but I couldn't begin to guess what this announcement was truly about. Teenage girls could hardly be recruited as soldiers. Perhaps it was as the principal said, surely it was true that Japan needed more factory workers. I watched as a few of the older girls raised their hands. The principal actually bowed to those who stepped forward. Look at these patriotic girls, he said. The emperor and their families will be so proud of them. Come, aren't there more of you who would like to join them in this endeavor? A few more girls came forward, but the principal wasn't satisfied. He gestured to Buntaro-san, who stepped up and shouted, 20 girls! The emperor requests 20 loyal girls from our school. You must do your part. No one else volunteered beyond that first half dozen girls. Buntaro-san was getting angry. If there are no more volunteers, I will choose them myself, he announced. He marched down the line and began pulling girls out one by one. You and you and you. One of those girls began to cry. Buntero-san whirled around and hit her with his stick. Shut up, you stupid girl. What do you have to cry about? Any sensible girl would be honored to serve the emperor. There was silence throughout the schoolyard now. We'd all stopped our work and were watching. Buntero-san dragged girl after girl out of line and shoved them toward the front. Suddenly, Jeong-shin gasped. Her older sister, Hee-won, had just been pulled from the line. Hee-won immediately dropped to a bow before Buntero-san. She started to say something, but he was already shouting at her. Get up! Go join the others! Hee-won rose with a whimper and stumbled toward the front. But when she got there, the principal looked at her and frowned. He shook his head and sent her back to her place in line. Not that one, he said to Buntero-san. Choose another. Just then, Buntero-san seemed to realize that the rest of us were watching. Back to work, all of you! He yelled in a fury. As we returned to our work, Jeong-shin caught my eye, her face stunned and bewildered. Her hands trembled as she handed me the rocks. She seemed nearly faint with relief that her sister wouldn't have to leave home and go to Japan. But why was that? No other girl had been sent back to the line. I could tell Jeong-shin didn't know either. She looked as confused as I felt. A terrible thought came to me. I tried to push it away, but that only seemed to make it hiss louder in my mind, like a snake coiling and baring its fangs until I could think of nothing else. Hee-won had been spared as soon as the principal had seen who she was. Why would a girl be given such consideration? It could mean only one thing. Their father was 친일파, a friend of the Japanese. Jeong-shin and her sister hurried away as soon as school was dismissed, and I went home on my own. I trudged heavily, as if my steps were weighed down by my thoughts. There were things that made sense now. Why Jeong-shin had been able to give me a rice cake when no one else had any rice at all. At the time, I'd been so excited to have duck again that I hadn't even wondered how she'd gotten it. Why she still had nice clothes, sometimes even new things, when everything I wore had been mended a dozen times. Maybe even why we always played at my house, not hers. Perhaps her family worried that their association with the Japanese might somehow be discovered. I hadn't thought about any of this very much before. There had been no reason for me to be jealous of Jeong-shin. If anything, it had been the other way around. She respected me because my father was a scholar and hers only a banker, and because I was class leader every year. Now I saw things in a glaring new light that seemed to hurt my eyes. With a start, I found myself thinking of Uncle. That day, we'd visited him at his shop. When I thought he was acting oddly, it hadn't been just my imagination. Uncle must have known about Jeong-shin's father, but he'd never told me. He must have been afraid I might say something to Jeong-shin that would somehow give away his secret activities. Could I be friends with someone whose family was 친일파?